And this just seems to say that me, Adorno, not me, as a philosophy professor, cannot be expected to be the revolutionary myself or himself. But there is a place for something like proto-revolutionary or critical philosophy that in a way would prepare the transitions but would not, let's say, step into it. And he seems to say that it's a wrong, too immediate kind of connection that might be drawn, and that the pressure to become a revolutionary oneself or to erase the separation or the border between theory and practice is in itself a conceptual, a philosophical error or mistake. And the text called Resignation seems to defend that ground. And the place on which he is standing is pretty narrow. It's not saying, no, I'm just doing philosophy, or I'm just doing humanities, or I'm just being a professor. It means thinking the transition to practice is not in itself, in a way, doing the transition, or in a way, being practical or acting, but it's this one tiny step before where critical reflection, also critical self-doubt, is allowed and has to flourish. And that's an interesting point because, of course, as we all know, Adorno was pretty sympathetic towards the student movement. Not so much so as Marcuse and much more so than Horkheimer, but still, more or less, he seemed to think at the time that this movement, like other strands of the '68 movement in the other countries, were doing the right thing in demanding democratization and demanding the opening of society and the breaking up of conventional mores and, let's say, barriers and social taboos. And it is not that the social movement is not right in claiming that this might involve or include some pretty drastic measures. And even on the political side, the late Adorno probably was no socialist in the strict sense, but at least he was open to the idea that late capitalism cannot have the last word. But he seemed to defy or resist the idea that out of theory of philosophy itself, this transition to practice or transition to, let's say, revolutionary practice or revolutionary politics is in itself possible or even helpful. And he seemed to think that the role of the intellectual or the role of the theoretician or the role of the philosopher is a different one, namely being the intellectual conscience of a movement or being an outsider to the movement while being sympathetic to it. And this is an interesting hesitant position or attitude, pretty much, by the way, mirroring the late Foucault's idea, never do politics, as he said in his 1978 lectures. Interestingly enough, something you would not expect from Foucault to say. But it seems to me a similar sentiment or similar attitude at that time. And so it's just interesting to note that even a theorist, even a philosopher insisting on the close interrelation or dialectical relationship between theory and practice, for himself reserves the right to remain, not purely, but mainly theoretical. And that there is something philosophically indecent, one might even say, insincere, in trying to evade that hesitation or not allow for that, in a way, room to maneuver in the realm of thought itself. Having said that, there is still a second opposition Adorno is insisting on, and this is the other text on critique, where he seems to say, many people accuse me of being purely negative, and he says, and I am. And this is not a problem, because also the relationship between the positive or the negative, or positivity and negativity, is in itself full of tangents and full of, let's say, conflict. And it could be that a theory that insists on the negative or the critical is not in itself forced to make the transition to the constructive or the positive. And when he talks of the compulsion to be positive, something I guess that rings even more true to the American ear, he just says is that the intellectual or the theoretician or the philosopher, as in the first case, also has a room to reserve and has a room to stay on which is not already compromised by, let's say, the reality principle, or by the idea that you have to have the best reform idea, or that you have to have a good suggestion of how things could be otherwise after you have criticized them. So he is, again, insisting on a space, on a room, which might be small, but it is the small of thinking, let's say, where the purely or mainly negative can flourish. And you should, that's something he seems to say, you should protect that space from the urge to be practical, constructive, or positive at the same time. And this, of course, is a criticism he's fending off that is not necessarily coming from the same side as the first criticism. So this is not the SDS pressuring him to, in a way, put up or set up a reform program. So these are the more realistic, and we might even say more bourgeois-minded critics that say a critical theory cannot remain negative in its basic thrust, but it should at least compromise itself, or at least, in a way, allow itself, or it should dare to compromise or to build compromises with a certain realization or practice, and in a way an attempt to build a better world. And I have to say, I pretty much understand the second stance too. The idea that a critic of society is necessarily forced or compelled in a way to engage in making things better, and even in a way provide blueprints, is something like a dead end. And I can see the idea that a critical or negativistic theorist defends the space in which it makes sense to remain critical or negative, cost it as much as it will. And so we have a defensive Adorno on two sides. So he's resisting the urge, in a way, to collapse, you already said that, collapse theory into practice, but he also is calling us to resist the urge to give up on the negative too easily in order to make contributions to a positive, better future or better society. And I have to say, if there is something specific about critical theory in the Adornian sense, it's probably this double hesitation. That means thinking vis-a-vis the better society and political practice, but not in itself doing it, enacting it, or prefiguring it, but insisting on this one step or this little space before that. And this might be the little threshold of critique or negativity. And this is something that has to be defended, because society and also the political comrades try to force you into compromising, let's say, the purity of the negative or the purity of the theoretical, already with demands of reality, of realizability, or what have you. When we were discussing Marcuse and Adorno last year, we were connecting it to the climate crisis and Latour, as you recall. And even concerning this topic, to me it makes sense with Adorno to defend a space where you don't have to have or provide or put on the table the better idea, the better program, or the program to a better future. Sometimes it makes sense insisting on radical or even extreme negativity. And this would be my keyword for, let's say, maybe the second half of our session, when we talk about the beginning and also the end of negative dialectics, which is, let's say, a thinking of and with the extreme. So, but as far as the first two texts I wanted to talk about go, this is what I have to say as a start.
Good. Let's talk a little bit about those first two texts, Critique and Resignation, before you entering in on negative dialectics. In part because what I find so interesting at the end of Resignation, in the last paragraph, is the way in which he does make such a bold and strong argument for the productivity of negative thought, right? You know, when you read these passages, I mean, he is really saying that you're in a better position. You're in a better position, praxis-wise, even, to be not making propositions, not coming up with programs, not giving alternatives, not providing solutions, right? And so he writes there, right, this is on the English version translation we have at page 293, you know, open thinking points beyond itself. It's about 10 lines into the final paragraph. For its part, a comportment, a form of praxis, it is more akin to transformative praxis than a comportment that is compliant for the sake of praxis, right? And so, and what he develops in the next few sentences is this idea that somehow in the confrontation that is the negative dialectic, there's something that survives. In thought, in critical thought, there is something that survives that is itself the most valuable element present, the most, and so he ends actually he ends on an uplifting note, suggesting that thought is happiness, even where it defines unhappiness, by enunciating it. By this alone, happiness reaches into the universal unhappiness. Whoever does not let it atrophy has not resigned. Now, so that's interesting because, of course, that's a notion of productivity that has to be distinguished from a notion of positivity, right? But that makes me think that, and this is something, and I'll come back to this in part because later, because you raised the question of Foucault's parallelisms, and I think that's an important question that we should address, but I don't want to distract, and I'll come back to that later. But with Foucault too. Sometimes I read these interventions, particularly Adorno's interventions, as being a necessary corrective, right? But when one approaches it from that perspective, of course, it has a different character, almost. So in other words, the extreme negativity, I think, comes out in part because he's trying to make a corrective to where philosophy is at that moment, particularly in the late 60s. Now, what that might suggest, of course, and I think this is probably true of all philosophical interventions, right, is that one need not always give them the extreme interpretation that they have, that they need in order to be that corrective. In other words, Sartre, with existentialism in the 40s and 50s, right? That too was a corrective. Now, what that might mean is that when he writes in his existentialist writings, late 40s, that existence precedes essence, that again is also kind of an extreme position, but it's because he's trying to confront a discourse and a space that he views as having shifted in the wrong direction. If that's true, right, then yes, to be sure, we could think of this text and these interventions as being extreme negativity, but maybe it was less, or maybe we can read it today as less extreme, in part because we can interpret it as something that was being pushed a little bit further in order to correct a deviation that was sensed. And that's where then some positivity could be found in this. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And of course, this is in itself an Adornian topos, let's say, on hyperbole and exaggeration. So when he says, for example, that so psychoanalysis is true as an exaggeration, or when he says all thinking is exaggerating. And the polemical nature of, or corrective, as you said, or polemics is, I think, also maybe the better word for that, definitely is there. I would shy away, however, to translate that into he meant something else which is less extreme, and even the negativity might be productive. I would think that exactly that idea would fall prey to what he seems to attack, namely the idea that there should be consolation in thinking. But this depends on how strong you make the term productivity, let's say. And I can imagine, let's say, harmless or weaker senses of that, and then I would definitely agree.
But there's definitely something productive here.
Yeah, exactly.
Here, right?
But
so the question is, it's not an alternative program. It's not a constructive criticism, which is his target. His target is the idea, well, why don't you give me constructive criticism? Don't just give me criticism. Give me something constructive. I can, that's his target.
But that gesture is not empty.
But so it's not empty, right? Because there's a remainder. There's something that survives, is what he says here. There's something that survives from the critique, I take it, that actually puts us in a better position. And so, which is why, of course, it's not nihilist. I mean, so the extreme negativity is not nihilist, which one might possibly, I mean, it depends how you define nihilism, but I mean, that would be a direction in which maybe if this were on a spectrum, it would be tending toward, the more extreme you go, the closer one might be to, conceptually, to something like nihilism. It's not. And in part, it has to be because there's actually a belief that this is ultimately more productive.
Yeah. I agree completely, except that I wouldn't use the word productive here.
Okay, so let's
look at the very last passages, and you might read again, if you can, the sentence about happiness, and thought is happiness, because I don't have the English before me. Could you just read
sure.
that? So this is the penultimate.
Okay. I mean, I think, so some of the passages, there's 12 lines up or something, is whatever has once been thought can be suppressed, whatever has once been thought can be suppressed, forgotten, can vanish, but it cannot be denied that something of it survives.
Yeah.
That seems very important. So this idea that on this dialectic, right, the theory, the thinking can be suppressed, but something of it will always remain, right? Something of it will always survive. He writes, for thinking has the element of the universal. What once was thought cogently must be thought elsewhere by others. And then he comes to the happiness. The happiness that dawns in the eye of the thinking person is the happiness of humanity. The universal tendency of oppression is opposed to thought as such. The universal tendency of oppression is opposed to thought as such. Thought is happiness, even where it defines unhappiness, by enunciating it. By this alone, happiness reaches into the universal. Unhappiness, whoever does not let it atrophy has not resigned, right? So it's not resignation, in fact, right? And it's not resignation because one continues to believe that thought, that critical thought somehow survives and can survive, which, as you were actually, as you started your presentation, and you were suggesting the idea that critical thought is necessary as a step before, possibly as a step before, you had suggested as to kind of lay the groundwork, to prepare a transition towards action, I was also thinking, and it's also on Adorno's thought, it's also necessary as a step after. And that's the doubt about the praxis. In other words, this moment of kind of critical reflection that he wants to hold on to, I think, is not only kind of in preparation for understanding action properly and acting properly, whatever that would mean, but it's also to question actions constantly, to doubt one's own praxis after the action, and to doubt it in part. And I mean, I think this was probably, I mean, well, I don't want to, I can't say what was going on at the time, but a fear, I mean, one interpretation would have been that it was a fear that the activities, the movements at the time were a form of groupthink that had some elements of coercion in them that might have been parallel to some of the forms of groupthink from the middle of the century.
Yeah, and he says so.
And so the idea there is that thinking needs to doubt, needs to critique, needs to put in question these forms of action, particularly to ensure that they don't devolve into kind of a coercive practice, right? And I think that's the idea in this final paragraph, that the thought that something survives. You can forget it, you can quash it, you could have a form of groupthink, but nevertheless, the critical thoughts will survive, and then we'll be able to, perhaps, we'll be able to resist new deviations, right?
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. Again, the only hesitation or reservation I have is against calling that moment productive, let's say.
Okay.
But that might be a matter of a choice of words only, exclusively, I could imagine. Because I read that in that way. It's not nihilistic, because it is committed, namely committed to a pretty good thing, namely happiness, universal happiness even. Right. But thinking is not bringing happiness about. It's not constructing, producing it, or generating it, but it thinks it. And it thinks it while it calls the bad or the wrong a bad or a wrong. And there is something like a mediated connection to practice, and even to the revolutionary practice of bringing the human good for all about, but without realizing it. And therefore there's this tension. It's something that is still up in the air, so it has not settled already. It's not already a machine that is in a way doing revolution or bringing about the good, but it's keeping it up in the air as a possibility. And therefore thought is happiness, even when it only calls out the wrong, which is something that should also resonate with you as a human rights activist. Sometimes it's not a matter of bringing about justice, but calling injustice injustice. And in a way also sometimes retaining that pure moment of being right in calling it injustice, even when it's not so clear what the just action would be. And for me, Adorno is defending that very moment. Even if he thought the student movement is right in calling for the radical transformation of society, which is called revolution, it might make sense not to determine the moment and the ways and the procedures and the strategies and the goals of the revolution, but just calling it out or thinking it. And I like the idea that the intellectual at the end of his life is in a way modest enough to attribute to himself exactly that role, not in a way guiding anyone. So this is an anti-avant-gardist, anti-Leninist position, of course, because he seems to say the philosophers will not be helpful in bringing the revolution about. They might even make things more complicated. But they are on the right side because they are thinking the abolition of injustices and the human wrongs. But they're not contributing to the program of changing this society or devising the roads or, let's say, the mechanisms or the techniques of happiness. But they are thinking happiness, and this is one way of realizing it, but not mundanely, but in thought. And this is something I would also defend against the idea that even that idea has to be somehow immediately productive. Sorry if I misinterpret your usage of the term. Because I would think the idea that thinking has to be productive means now you have to cash out what this means. And he seems to say, no, I don't. I'm just, in a way, evoking it, calling, not the name of God, but the name of the revolution or the universal abolition of injustice. And this is something that's also hesitant, zögerlich, zaudernd, I would say. And this is an interesting gesture to end a book, by the way, because it's bold, but it's also modest at the same time. And by the way, historically, nobody was happy reading these lines. Everyone was, in a way, disappointed. The student movement was disappointed because he was betraying the revolution by not engaging in it. But the bourgeois thinkers, the social democrats, let's say, were disappointed because he was not even contributing to social democratic or evolutionist reform. Because he seemed to say, no, I'm more radical in thought, but this means I'm not even radical in my politics, but in between. And that's an uneasy chair to sit on, to say the least. Maybe you want more. You want him to sit
No. I do think it's important somehow to distinguish different forms of positivity or I mean, the reason I used the word productivity is because I don't want to use the word positivity, because that was clearly not was at stake. But I'm not sure that the productivity needs to be defined more or articulated more, because I don't think that it's part of the method to be productive. The method is productive, but it's not a quest to be productive, and it's not an effort to be productive, and it's certainly not an effort to increase the productivity of the method in any way. But it is a statement that Adorno, at least on my reading, believes that this does not lead you down a path where this does not lead you down a path. This negative dialectics or extreme negativity does not lead you down a path where you are ultimately disarmed or harmed. That you are better off taking this path, which is that aspect, and I think he's comfortable leaving it at that, saying no, this isn't resignation, right? Au contraire, he's trying to suggest like I'm practically the only one actually who's not resigned, right? But that doesn't increase or decrease, and it's not like something that we can work on. I think it's an inherent characteristic of this method, of this way of approaching problems that he's offering.
Okay. Yeah, no, I see.
Yeah.
Again, this is only a stance I would not call
so
productive or geared towards productivity.
Somehow it's related to non-nihilism somehow.
but it's also not functional to anything else. Whereas for me, the metaphor of productivity, in a way, would evoke some kind of functionality, instrumentality, which he doesn't seem to connote.
No, well, it couldn't be instrumental.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And then it would be
So-
productivity without product, which might be a nice way of
Yeah.
putting it.
Okay, but I mean, maybe the only point, though, is that on this question of, well, yeah, I mean, the way I was introducing it was the corrective notion, which I think is important somehow. So it means that we're, and you're right, this is in the thought of Adorno itself. It's in the negative dialectic itself. These tensions and the ways in which confrontation can push in one direction or another. I mean, this wouldn't have had to be called negative dialectics if it wasn't for the fact that he was within a Hegelian, resisting a Hegelian discourse, or resisting a Marxist discourse as well, right? So, so that would lead me to think that on this precise question of where exactly it is situated in terms of its negativity, right? In part, that question itself is a product of this being an intervention that needed to take apart the piece of the dialectic, which we'll get to next, that somehow resolved positively
Or
integrates it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So should we take comments and questions concerning these two texts before we move on?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Marcus. There's a mic, yeah. It's better for the stream.
Is my question, is it
Yeah.
working? My question is about the notion of possibility, also at the very end of this resignation essay. I think it's very important when he says here at the very end, thinking is not the reproduction, the mental reproduction of what already is. As long as it does not interrupt itself, it holds on the possibility. And then he says in the very end of the introduction in the negative dialectics that, of course, the possibility cannot be in opposition to reality, and this is social reality, because this would be only an abstract possibility. But at the same time, it cannot be a possibility completely integrated or realized in our social reality, because thinking is a transcendence of our social reality or our social world. So it means that there has to be a kind of possibility which is internal to thought itself, because thought has a transcendence if it is about something universal, as he says in the very end. And this is why the thinker realizes happiness. So he tries to give it an ethical twist in saying, if thinking is not about something singular, but something universal, it realizes happiness. And then the context is of course not only the thinking of what thought is about. So, in being a human being, I'm able to think, and this is what the human being would be all about. It is in the context of social struggles, as he says before. But then the thinking of of a possibility would mean we have to think what is missing in the social struggles. So what is not there. This means who is not there in the social struggles and who is not able to speak, or what we are not able to say And this is where negativity comes in, I think. So this would mean possibility. The possibility means it's something not fully integrated in reality, but at the same time not opposed to the reality we live in right now. So it's something on the border. It's a transcendence, but the transcendence in the immanence of our social world, so to speak. And maybe this is, in its very structure, what happiness could mean in thinking as a philosophical encounter, of course, which is not completely a subjective point of view. It's a collective practice then. So I was wondering how you would understand this very crucial notion of possibility here in the very end.
I had two quick thoughts, and then one of them is possibility as the gap somehow, or possibility as the gap or the remainder or the aspects of non-identity that are that result from the confrontation. So I hear that notion of possibility as precisely what here I am again talking about productivity, but what is productive in the dialectical clash. It's almost as if one thinks of, the CERN collider, the way in which kind of somehow as these molecules clash, there's some possibility, right? Would be the word that I would think of. I think that I would say is produced, that comes from this in some way. So that was one quick thought. But the other thought, which we can come back to later maybe, is Daniele Lorenzini is developing a way of interpreting the Foucauldian genealogy as a possibilizing move of kind of unearthing possibilities. And so there too, I think there's probably some conversation we could have between Adorno's notion of possibility and Foucault's notion of possibilizing genealogies. Two quick thoughts, but go ahead, Martin.
No, I have similar associations. For me, there's a Weberian line in this, and the debate about real possibilities in historical sciences. And so already Weber was looking for a way to make sure that the historian talks about, or the sociologist for that matter, talks about not only what was there and what was happening, but also what could have happened. And there was the idea that there should be some methodological rules, in a way, guaranteeing this. And Adorno was always trying to say that conformist sociology is only doubling the social facts that are already there. This was what he was calling positivism. Whereas a real sociology would also, in a way, evoke or disclose what the social could be. And this, I would agree, would be something like a social theory of the possible. And what he calls open thinking, offenes Denken here, seems to be exactly that, a thinking of the possible, even vis-a-vis the things that are pretty closed and pretty factual and not possible. But this is definitely a fundamental layer of this whole project. And by the way, if I may, to me it makes sense to say, for that very reason, this is an ontological sort of enterprise, because thinking the possible is not a matter of only thinking or epistemological issues, but it's also thinking, let's say, the ontological valence of the possible within the real. And this, in a way, would bring that kind of thinking pretty close to a couple of other paradigms, namely Deleuzianism, for example, that in a way would play on the virtual here. And sometimes there might be convergences between these programmatics that seem unlikely but might be founded in something like these very abstract notions. Sarah Bianchi.
Thank you very much for the...
Yes, it's recorded. We all hear.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction and the discussion. And I would like to jump into the discussion on the question of the adjective productive, because I can absolutely understand all the hesitations, and but by thinking of Foucault and his understanding of productivity as constituting something, I think I sympathize with the word, because for me it's something like the catalyst or the motor of pushing developments further and not just being stuck in wrong circuits, like in the dialectics of enlightenment, for example. So it's like the question how the tension can be remained or kept vivid. So I would like to ask you how you would understand it, and if I may already link to the introduction from the negative dialectics. There he has the so important phrase of sich selber rücksichtslos zu kritisieren. So this is for me something like the productive formula I would be favoring.
That's in the introduction?
Yes,
It's
it's
in
in
the
the
first
middle.
page?
Yes,
In the-
yes,
in the-
in the middle.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, it's, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which starts as the possibility of philosophy, right? Again, I have some thoughts about
Yeah, go ahead.
Foucault's relationship here, which seems appropriate because it was precisely that notion of productivity, right, that was the turning point in his thought in 1972, right, as he exits Attica and he rethinks the whole project on the prison and says, you know, I've only been thinking of the prison in its repressive form, right? But what I really need to understand is, you know, what it does, right? And that's the notion of productivity there that leads to the development in the punitive society, but then ultimately leads to Discipline and Punish, which explores the productivity of these disciplinary forms. And of course, mostly the kind of the creation of docile bodies and such. And of course, the same move is in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which is to reject the repression hypothesis in order to understand. And you can think of practically all of his work from 72 on, really, as being about how we create ourselves as subjects, or how we govern ourselves through these forms, right? And that is a notion of productivity. I would need to get the text right in front of me. I forget the exact word he uses, but you know, it's page 24, right? Where it's like, no, we have to, and so it would be interesting to figure it out. Maybe I don't know.
That would be a different seminar.
Yeah, that'll be a different seminar. Now, but then the question is, how is that different than here? Because I think there's something different going on here. I think that the notion that I was suggesting, which I'll hold on to for the time being, of why it is that one would want to engage in negative dialectics, or why it is that one would want to hold on to thought that survives, that is the only thing that is non-resignation, somehow it has a slightly different character. Because I don't think that it's suggesting, I don't think that it's suggesting, and this is important, I don't think that it's suggesting something epistemological in the same way that, that Foucault is suggesting, which means possibly that at the end of the day, there isn't the same constitutiveness in Adorno of what this method is doing, I think. So it's very, epistemologically, it's very different, right? Yeah. A quick thought is that, I mean, at the end of the day, right, where Foucault leaves us is in a space where we need to understand our own ways in which power, knowledge, power have affected our own understandings of ourselves, of our milieu, of where we are today. And that is a space that ultimately is bootstrapped again by the forms of knowledge power that surround us. I'm not sure that at the end of the day with Adorno, and here I'll turn it over to you, I don't think that the idea is that we would get to a space where the relationship to truth is such that it remains constructed by forms of knowledge power that we need to deconstruct. I think that there's a less mediated relationship to truth for Adorno when you come out of this process, or when whoever does not let it atrophy, as he says, right? It's a less mediated, it's a closer proximity somehow to truth, I think. But what do you think?
So the whole topos of truth would be also a different seminar, and this would not be the best passages to approach it, I fear. And also the passages we selected from the negative dialectics don't really have a clear grip on that, having to do with, let's say, the dramaturgy of the whole book and the status of the meditations on metaphysics. But that's, I think, a different issue. I think we can agree on there's probably a deep convergence in the philosophical stances the two radical critiques of Foucault and Adorno have or embody, and there might be a different sense of the results or the telos of that activity or negativity or criticality. And I'm only resisting against the too functionalist or too teleological kind of language in the very term productivity. Even if I see, you can of course reframe it or rephrase it. And I only wanted to insist on the fact that Adorno is pretty clear on the insistence or affirmation that the place the negative dialectician or the philosopher inhabits is almost uninhabitable. It's not a stable place, but it's a processual place of unrest, a threshold, let's say. And it might be that the Foucauldian language sometimes is trying to demarcate something more stable. But that's also, I think, almost for another occasion to settle. So, Frieda Vogelmann is, I think, last for that round, because I would like to turn to those passages in the negative dialectics that to me seem to resonate with these more extreme or ultra-negativistic side, even if we take it apart in the discussion again afterwards.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let me just voice a certain concern about your apologetic reading of this resignation text, both of you, because I think there is something that has to be said as well, as we are in a dialectic space after all, and that is, it is to me, it brings out the best and the worst in Adorno, really, because it is almost indistinguishable from the ideology of the philosopher in his ivory tower, as well as the philosopher who, with all the good arguments that you presented, has the right to remain in his negative dialectics. But there is the other side as well, and you cannot pass over that reading this text. So let me just make more explicit two aspects of that. So for the one instance is that this is not in continuity with the actuality of philosophy. There, the goal was to destroy that which gave rise to the need to form the constellation, right? There was a problem that this constellation of concepts was meant to destroy. And that is one of the most powerful passages in this text, The Actuality of Philosophy. Nothing of that survives here. So you have to at least comment on that, because I think there is not resignation in here, but there is a dangerous closeness to the ivory tower ideology. And in this, yes, to quietism. And in this respect, actually, the right parallel would not be Foucault, but Althusser, who says, no, we philosophers are right in doing what we are doing. So I think you can't pass over this challenge that Adorno lays down here in reading this text. So I'm just curious how you would answer that, because I think you need to.
I know how I would answer that.
And you should. So your reading is more productive, let's say, than mine.
So I'll start, and then you. But we have to flip the order a lot more too. It is that it's that precisely what I was trying to suggest is there's a sensibility that rubs me the wrong way, even if theoretically I might even say I agree, and that's the difference. And that's the difference. In other words, when he writes, for instance, on page 290. About Marx, that he may have presented the 11th thesis on Feuerbach so authoritatively because he knew he wasn't entirely sure about it. It's like, come on. No, right? I mean, really? I mean, if there's one thing I wanted to hold on to, right, it was the 11th thesis, right? I mean, and so it's just like, there's another way to say this. There's got to be another way to say this. There's got to be another way to say this. And in part, that's where I situate myself, both in thinking that, well, something is entirely right about the instability that we find ourselves in, the need to confront, the way in which it creates possibilities, the problematic nature of suggesting that there is a resolution, and the benefit of being stuck in the complexity of the present, all of which I am, right? Without then saying, okay, but without then somehow making light of this desire for praxis and action, right? So that's how I read this. But you have a different view, or is it a less?
No, I think I'm agreeing with Frida that this is there. So there is something like a defense. I wouldn't say of the ivory tower, because in the ivory tower, the universal Unrecht or injustice is not thought. The ivory tower thinkers are not leftists, but they think they are beyond left and right. Whereas he seems to think there is a place for the leftist philosopher. And you're right with the comparison to Althusser, which is something like abstractable from the real struggles. And if you put it like that, it sounds like quietism. I would say it had a different, but that's more historical thesis. than a systematic one. I think it had a different function because it wanted to say even the people who are politically right or on the right side are too tempted by what you call the groupthink of leftist and social and political movements and by a turmoil of getting into practice immediately. And he wanted to resist that also for political reasons, because, so, yeah.
But the question is that the right gesture today?
Yeah,
If
okay. Yeah,
because
okay.
we're reading these texts today, and
Yep.
I think,
Yep.
especially in critical theory, that,
Mhm.
that is not something to pass
Yep.
over lightly.
Yep.
So is that something that we should take up today? Are we seeing too much action and not enough thought? Is that really our predicament? I'm very doubtful
Okay.
of that.
Okay, but that's another question.
No, but
So
that's the same question.
No, it's the question we then raised. We were so far only in a way trying to reconstruct also a historical place for that kind of answer. And I would say the productivity, I would say the sense of insisting on this unrestful, let's say, dynamic, but also hesitant resistance also against immediate practice or pseudo-practice, as he calls it. And you are right. So the next question would be whether this is so much dependent on a certain also socio-historical situation that it might be gone, that moment. And it might be that thinking the present would, in a way, require something else. So let's go on to the second phase, because it's there already in the preface and the introduction of the negative dialectics, but it's ultra present in these passages, uncanny passages on After Auschwitz from the Meditations on Metaphysics from the Negative Dialectics, the third part, where he seems to say, everything I say is indexed historically. There's no way of thinking otherwise today, and this today, or this presentness, this historical moment, has a clear name, and it's called After Auschwitz, which means everything is different after or with this event having passed. And thinking and philosophy today will have to take on responsibility for this very historical and also moral moment it includes. And therefore, Frieda is right. So taking up the legacy of critical theory in this sense also means providing a right or an adequate diagnosis of a present moment and meaning what the present moment requires us to think. Just speaking about Adorno in 1966, he says philosophy cannot engage in reconciliation, integration, or all kind of pseudo-religious, pseudo-theological projects of, in a way, making sense of the world. But thinking after Auschwitz means making no sense or making unsense of the world. And every attempt to think otherwise, thinking through reconciliation or integration, is something like sinning against the historical truth of this very moment, which is called After Auschwitz, which means the very values and the very categories through which bourgeois and, let's say, traditional thinking was thinking, are utterly devalued. And this is an interesting ultra-historicism, claiming that one could not think otherwise at that very moment because it would mean, in a way, sinning against the exigencies of the time. But it also means that classical philosophy, that was constructive, productive, reconciliatory, making sensey, is completely devalued, but not for systematic reasons, also for systematic reasons. So the failure of idealism is the formula for that. But it's devalued by history itself. And this is, let's say, the most Benjaminian moment maybe in the late work of Adorno, where he seems to say this one moment in history is one that is characterized by exactly that kind of, and now that's again my phraseology, extreme negativity or negative extremity, and not allowing that to enter thought would be not to think, or to only think constructively, reconciliatorily, or productively. And this would be a sin, sorry for the religious language, a sin against thinking itself. And now we would like to ask, what does that mean? So what does thinking think if it cannot think in terms of integration or synthesis or reconciliation? And he doesn't seem to offer too much, except it means taking seriously the historicity of the situation of the thinker itself. So that's the diagnostic part. Again, in parentheses, an ultra-Foucauldian kind of topos, so that thinking means thinking the present, or thinking in the present and of the present. The second is thinking the moral dimension of the present, which leads him to formulate that pretty unlikely new categorical imperative in the second paragraph of this part, where he seems to say thinking after Auschwitz means thinking and acting in a way that Auschwitz cannot happen again. And the third, of course, would be, and this is the more methodological part, that it means integrating the critique of totality, the critique of synthesis and reconciliation into systematic thinking itself. And it's, again, the same topos that we already know from the other texts, that there is a space for thinking that, as he also says, thinks against itself, that tries to think against its own tendency to produce or to construct synthesis, reconciliation, and meaning. And again, a little bit like in my first remarks, I would like to insist on and defend at least the philosophical gesture of saying that there is a space for thinking that is not stable, not foundational, and not fixed, but that in a way essentially consists in radical self-critique and self-undermining. And that there could be a form of philosophy that will never rest when it does not do that. And therefore it will be inherently negative, and it will be inherently thinking against synthesis or integration and against the kind of consolations and reconciliations traditional, let's say, bourgeois philosophy was offering. I take Frieda's point that it would be wrong to think that this is a systematic thesis on thinking of philosophy as such. It cannot be, because the first element in these three things I was just trying to, in a way, keep apart, even if they belong together. The first idea was every thinking is thinking in its time and in its historical context and in a certain legacy. Therefore, it cannot be that we today have to inhabit the same, let's say, figure of thought. We are not thinking after Auschwitz. We are thinking, let's say, after Auschwitz. Because our society is not the one that, in a way, that was denying also the historical guilt of the Third Reich. We are in a different phase, namely a society that has already integrated, in a way, that guilt and responsibility into a certain social self-understanding. And now we probably have to attack maybe sometimes the too easy, however you want to call that, too easy forms of Vergangenheitsbewältigung and integration of that kind of negativity into one's own self-understanding. Therefore, Adorno seems to urge us to ask us what is pressing and, in the Foucauldian phrase, dangerous today. And it cannot be the same thing, because this is a text that's 53 years old. Mm-hmm. But the idea that you have to think vis-a-vis and against your own time, in your time and against your time at the same time, so to say, seems to be the methodological imperative that also means that the very forms of synthesis and reconciliation offered at a given time are the things you have to attack. And they will be different. And it could be that it's not traditional philosophy and the consolations of religion or theology that are challenging us, but it might be other things, maybe scientism, maybe positivism in a new, let's say, neurological or capitalist form of way. But I would like to take away again from that text the urge of not thinking of philosophy, and sorry again as a productive practice or enterprise, but exactly, again, as a practice of thinkingly undoing productivities, consolations, reconciliations. And even that, of course, would have some resonances with other forms of, let's say, anti-foundationalist or anti-fundamentalist philosophies. But there might be a specific profile of this, and it could be that the insistence on the context specificity and the historical specificity of thinking itself might be the best part or the best point of starting to discuss this very idea, because there is something uncanny about the insistence that in 1966 you cannot not think Auschwitz or after Auschwitz, as if this 20, 25 years had not changed anything. But it seems to think that history itself places a certain responsibility and a certain burden on thinking even 20 years, that means a generation and a half later. And this is something I find fascinating, but I would also like to call dangerous or hazardous, because it's not a place on which you can stand easily, because it's also, again, thinking against your own fundaments and against the own soil on which you stand. So far for this part.
Yeah. So, so I have a lot of thoughts, and let me try and organize them somewhat. I think there's no doubt that the instability, the fundamental instability of negative dialectics presents a challenge to this passage about the categorical imperative. And then the question is, how do you resolve that challenge in a way? Obviously it presents a challenge because, if anything, the categorical imperative is the opposite of the unstable, of the rethinking. It's the radical opposite of that, right? So part of it is going to have to do with the question of the historicity of our positioning, and entirely right that the whole purpose, maybe I will say productivity of this conversation, is to actually ask the question of whether or not critical theory today needs to be pushed in a particular direction or not. And when I was arguing last year, and still believe in Praxis 1313, about the primacy of praxis as opposed to, right, which was rejected, right? It was a corrective. It is a corrective. And so I agree entirely that in terms of how this kind of shakes out today, it's that somehow the corrective needs to push in a different direction right now. What's interesting is that it's almost as if Adorno had identified this, particularly in the critique. There's this passage in the critique discussion where it's on page 284 of the English translation, so it's about smack middle of the essay, where he identifies critical thought as becoming departmentalized. And he has this sentence where he says, critique is being departmentalized, as it were. It is being transformed from the human right and human duty of every citizen into a privilege of those who are qualified by virtue of the recognized and protected positions they occupy. And he was talking about the fact that he had a privileged position and that he was able to continue to engage in critique because of the deference given to professors in Germany at this period still. But but it's interesting that there was already a notion there, which I think has only been accentuated since 1969, that critical thought has been departmentalized, has been contained, and has been kind of limited to certain academic fields predominantly, and at the margins of certain academic fields, and in marginal academic fields especially. So it's interesting that he was cognizant of that himself, because I think that's even more true of the present, which then means that we do need to recalibrate in some way, I would think. So the historicity becomes key here, and in that I think you're entirely right. What does it mean to say that we have to arrange our thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen? Now, and it has to also mean that we have to arrange our thoughts and actions so that slavery will never repeat itself. It has to also mean that we have to, in the United States, arrange our thoughts and actions so that Jim Crow will never repeat itself, or that mass incarceration will never repeat itself. There's a way in which I think Auschwitz is, in a way, standing in, and after Auschwitz is, both after Auschwitz and Auschwitz are standing in for forms of gross injustice that have to be able to be thought in terms of other historical contexts as well, and have to be thought in this way that, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, in their book, The Undercommons, has this discussion of thinking about abolition, in the context of abolition of slavery, abolition of injustice, abolition of our racial inequalities in the United States, thinking broadly about abolition of the prison, etc., not only of abolishing these practices, but abolishing the societies that produce these practices. Now, I'm not sure, I mean, I suspect that could be sympathetic with the analysis here, although it's not explicitly on the page in the same way, right? It's not saying we have to arrange our thoughts and actions so that we, in a sense, abolish the society that, or abolish the relations or the social relations that made Auschwitz possible. It is more kind of in the moment. It is more about not having the historical phenomenon rather than dealing with the societies or the social relations that make it possible to have that phenomenon of injustice. And what we would need to think about in the present in thinking through this is, and it would be different, I'm sure it would be different in Germany, and geography and spatial issues are key here and can't be avoided. Coming from the United States, I would be thinking in these times particularly, specifically about the avoiding the society that made possible something like racialized mass incarceration in the United States. But I'm not sure that, so there is a categorical imperative here, which is feels uncomfortably stable
And
But-
uncomfortably specific.
and uncomfortably specific.
Maybe too specific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although, I don't know, is it possible that that there is a stable point of moral judgment that remains fixed as we engage in forms of negative dialectics to analyze society or something like that? I mean, that would be the question, I think, that comes out from this passage in terms of its historical setting.
These are complicated, of course, and serious, ultra-serious issues. And to do justice to them also within the context of Adorno's other oeuvre, of course, would also mean talking about what it means to use a proper name and what the proper name is. Is the proper name a stand-in for something else or an exemplar, or is it singular in a specific sense? And this is also a topos enormously important in the rest of the book. And then the questions come up, does Adorno at that time think that there are similar things like Auschwitz? He does, so he names Vietnam, for example. He names Hiroshima sometimes, and he seems to think there are likenesses, resemblances of other kind of injustices to that, even if this remains singular and therefore representative of something that is more extreme than other things. And that's also on the, let's say, exegetical level, extremely hard to point down. But I think the, let's say, formal or methodological point is pretty straightforward. History forces you to think a certain thing, a certain event, a certain thought at a certain time. And it forces you to think its opposite, namely the categorical imperative not to let that happen again. And whatever is there in this specific proper name, it comes from history itself, not from thought. So this is a radically anti-idealist gesture. So what freedom would be, or what the moral thing to do would mean, is not up for grabs. It's not up to decide to the theorist, or the transcendental ego, or what have you, absolute spirit. It comes from the other of thinking, namely from history itself. And the crimes associated with the name of Auschwitz are in a way material, they are factual. And not even thinking can unthink the factuality of that. And therefore thinking has to accept something like a legacy or a responsibility or a guilt and has to react to that. So that for me is a very deep and interesting philosophical conception that seems hard to reconcile with the more dialectic Hegelian idealist leanings of the text that are there too. The idea that, almost in a Levinasian sense in a way, so the other of history and of guilt and of the injustice comes over the one who thinks about it. It's nothing that he could change or alter, but something he has to accept also as a Forderung. So this is something I see, and it's also connected to what Adorno in general thinks about morality, that it's not something you construct or think about, but something that has to be thought in a certain way. So that's his Kantian moment, at least in moral philosophy. But that, again, and that makes it also ultra-complicated, is only connected to history negatively. Not that, again, is the only, let's say, content of this categorical imperative, which is a strange thing, because we would think a categorical imperative should at least give you something to do and not something not to do, whereas the content of that imperative is purely negative, and in that it also is kind of limitless, because what would it mean not to let that happen again? How many things do you have to do to not let that happen again? And all these kind of things are pretty, I think, hard to get your head around. So again, we have something like an operation of, let's say, extreme negativity that comes from something that is not thinking or spirit or thought itself. And therefore, philosophy has to remain in contact with, in a feeling, touching contact with its other, that is determining it in some way. but there's also in a way a space for philosophy to actively take on the responsibility to think that very thing of the present, and to think these very things you should not let happen again. And I would again insist on the fact that this is methodologically ultra-negativist, because it lets itself determine, but only in a negative way. It makes you take on a historical responsibility, but does not give you a project, a vision of a good society. It only gives you a vision of the society that is not catastrophic, namely one that does not go to that extreme, which was the ultimate crime. And that's, again, Frida is right. We should think about what is our Auschwitz today, if you allow that bad pun, which means thinking what is the condition of the present and its extremes. And Adorno is probably, again, not giving us anything. So this is the task of thinking, to determine its own historical place and time, and also determining its own exigency, its own Forderung, and its own being determined by its other in historical specificity. And again, a philosophy that does that, or urges us to think in that way, is not, productive. It's not constructive. It's not conciliatory. It's not integrative, but something else. And again, I would call that an unstable, maybe slightly impossible kind of practice. But this is what Adorno seems to think what thinking or philosophy or theory in the form of negative dialectics is. And probably not even the name negativism, that is quite fashionable in philosophy today, is a good name for it, because the negativism term seems to connote that there is a productive side to that negativity, whereas his whole point seems to be, at least in these darkest passages of the book, that there is no point and nothing to be learned except that this one thing should not happen again, and this is not something you learn, this is something you have to do.
So, a couple of thoughts. One is that it's fascinating the way you bring up the negativity of that categorical imperative. I'm wondering though if it's negative in the same way as negative dialectics. So I'm wondering if, I mean, it is surely negative in the sense that you're right, that it's a categorical imperative that works through like not doing, you know. But I'm wondering if it's different than what goes on in the confrontation of negative dialectics, because it does have a certain fixity to it that I feel is less that there isn't in the negativity of negative dialectics. Now, and it does feel though as if one of the real problems on the table right now is this question of productivity. At least that's the way that's the way our conversation has evolved in relation to this text. And for some reason, as we were talking about this, I was thinking about the passage in The Actuality of Philosophy where he talks about these keys, right? These keys that open doors, and the key has to be the right size, and it can't be too big, and it can't be too small, and the keys are these concepts. I take it. I mean, the keys that he uses as examples in The Actuality of Philosophy are class, the concept of class is one key that seems to open a lot. The other is commodity, the commodity form that opens a lot. So, of course, two classic Marxist concepts that he argues are middle level enough to open something up. And you had used the word constellation earlier, although I felt that you were using it again in a more extreme negativity than I would give to it, because it seems to me that these keys evolve into, I think, constellations that ultimately are helpful in unpacking something like questions of free will in the negative dialectics. The debate between free will and determinism, which he argues is I was going to say productive again, instinctively, but that there's work that is done through the negative dialectic confrontation of free will and determinism that actually can help us understand the way in which each one is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, such that if you actually do believe in determinism, then you're going to end up being quiescent or something. He has that passage. It's around 285 or 286 or something like that, where he's discussing that. And each one says, and so it is through that method that that he wants to move forward in some way. And it's through the method, I think, of constellations, which he discusses in the section on constellations, that he methodically wants to move forward, which suggests to me that that even though this is framed again in negative terms, and even though there is the extreme negativity of negative dialectics, that it remains the right path. And so, yeah.
No, I see. And I could also imagine a reading of the whole book that would stress exactly that path-like quality of negative dialectics, its methodological side, so to say, that also would insist on the fact that Adorno definitely is devising something like a whole way of philosophizing centered on the notion of constellations, of course, that in a way would allow for something like a different kind of thinking. And it could be that the aesthetics theory, unfinished in 1970, in a way would have been the complement to this kind of part of the negative dialectics. And this is perfectly sound and, I think, possible. By choosing the beginning of the Meditations of Metaphysics from that book, I would insist on the other, let's say, moment of the book, where he seems to say, after Auschwitz, the very idea of key, the very idea of path, is burnt and is gone and is rotten, as he says, Müll. And I would like to also retain that element, while not denying that the others are also there, and the idea that there could be a post-idealist philosophy that looks like idealism, but it is, in a way, its negativist complement. These passages are all there, and the relation to Hegel is so complex that this is probably also one phase of this relationship. But for me, these passages, these 12 or 15 pages, insist on something more serious, more somber. This is the Becker tone in the whole book, that this is something you do while you think and say and know that you cannot do it. And this has an in a way, self-undermining quality that he seems to think would be the nature or the essence of thinking itself. And thinking that would be something else, like a constructive, productive, architectonic, would also be a sellout of thinking itself. And I would like to retain, let's say, that moment without saying that this is the only one and that this is the last word or this is the only thing that is there to think. But I would insist on the fact that this seems to be, let's say, the core philosophical experience the book is building on and is articulating. And this is something that's hard to swallow for philosophers who want to go on philosophizing. This is hard to swallow for critical theorists who want to have a theory that is explicating their very practice or methodology. And maybe it's even hard to swallow for anyone who wants to know from critical theory what to do, Friede. But it seems like a stance. And this is probably something we should try to think or understand or even follow. But now it's, of course, your turn. Please.
Yeah, so we're going to open it up. Let me just say one thing, though. Because I find myself in an odd position of rehabilitating there's a certain aspect of Adorno here, which I wasn't expecting to find myself in that position. But it almost feels to me as if we extend that moment, that dark moment that I think you rightly find in the text and one rightly finds actually throughout Adorno's work, if one extends that moment, or if one is in it too long, it feels to me, then I think the answer becomes praxis for praxis's sake, basically. I mean, that's where it pushes me in a way, because at that point why not? Because right? I mean, it's like, well, there's nothing else, so yes, so take to the streets and right, and that kind of almost severs it. And it's an interesting way, of course. It would, right? Because it would not be sufficiently dialectical, maybe, right? I don't know. That's just where I'm thinking.
So let me just add it. I think I'm the last person to demand of critical theory to actually lay out the plans for the new society. But I think we can use one aspect of this dark moment that Martin mentioned, and that you rightfully said is problematic if prolonged too much. And that is, for me, the moment in which it is historicist and materialist, and a safeguard against the return of idealism in critical theory that we actually are witnessing, I would argue. Right? The return to Hegel and to Kant instead of Marx and Engels, for example, which is very prominent here, is just one instance of this return to idealism. And I think reminding ourselves that thought, if it wants to take up the challenge of critical theory in its, let's say, earlier phase, needs to be aware of that it is determined by not thought, and to come to terms with that, which cannot mean neglecting or defining that away. So I think that would be productive way of engaging with this moment. And it's not the only way, and it's not the last word of that, but it is one aspect that we can actually take up from it.
Yeah, Jean-Pierre?
Yes, about this question of Auschwitz and the singularity of this event, of this matter of fact, Martin Saar well said that there are some other examples that Adorno takes for Auschwitz, so Vietnam, torture as such. Also, we can understand in this way that for Adorno it's not the only matter of fact of Auschwitz or the rupture after Auschwitz, but also the structural conditions that made Auschwitz possible. And these structural conditions are into our own categories, our own logics, our own concepts. So all the reflection of Adorno on unconceptual, non-conceptual, on non-identity, all these critiques of the different forms of identity thought are maybe what we can take as a not something positive, but the proper work of critiques, of the proper work of negative dialectics. And it's not only something negative in the signification of yes, how you just developed here, but yes, something related with the capacity of language to criticize itself and to reflect upon itself. And that's maybe why also the constellation is said, Adorno says that the language is the model of constellative denken or thinking or of constellation. So we could say more about the proper texture or the proper way of expressing of critic selves. I think it's important related to categories, to the necessity of criticizing our own categories. Also when Adorno says that we can do without our own categories, we can do without the category of identity, but we have to think against it in each case. So, thank you.
Yes, I can only underline what you said, that giving a full picture of that kind of philosophical program or operation would also involve reconstructing the philosophy of language and of mind that is embedded in it, and which is the critique of identity thinking and what it means to criticize categories of identity while not having others. And this also is a certain kind of reflexivity that is inbuilt into this critical program that is also, I would say, pretty radical and also not really redeemed, I think, by many current or contemporary theories. And this would be difficult. And the other thing that you said, your first point is also, I think, crucial. Behind the formulation of the new categorical imperative stands, of course, a social theoretical vision of what structural conditions of these kinds of events are. And this is also something that Adorno thought would also be approachable via, let's say, social theoretical, sozialforscherische methods. And this is something that also, I think, would complement this moral stance. It's not just erecting this new categorical imperative, but it means understanding what led to the kind of things we should not let happen again. That this is an enlightenment kind of program, and his pedagogical writings, in a way, were trying to also erect that kind of urgency to also for politicality education and schooling, let's say. No, it's true. Yeah. Herr Schmidt-Dominik?
I want to ask for one issue which kind of also connects the texts on resignation and critique and the beginning of the introduction of the negative dialectics, namely. Let's begin with Adorno's reading of the thesis on Feuerbach, and it's like I always thought when I read Adorno on the thesis on Feuerbach, also like in this Magen notes on theory and praxis, that he deals with theory and praxis as if this would be just like any pair of dialectical opposites. It's like sometimes theory is the main field of struggle. Sometimes it's praxis. It's comme ci comme ça, and this seems to completely neglect that this relation of theory and praxis is also precisely what is at stake in Adorno's very own dialectical method. And it's like in the beginning of the negative dialectics, on the first page, he says something like, we have to properly separate theory and praxis. And on the second page, he seems to be completely conforming to a primacy of practice, but he puts it in other words, in a primacy of acknowledging the historicity of one's thought of thinking, and it's like the same phenomenon on the end of resignation, where he also says, offenes Denken weist über sich hinaus. Seinerseits ein Verhalten, eine Gestalt von Praxis, ist es der verändernden Verwandter als eines, das der Praxis willen pariert. So there he even seems to admit that there is a primacy of this. Es kommt darauf an, sie zu verändern. And kind of my question would be how you would what your take would be on this issue, and it's also like I could never read the 11th thesis on Feuerbach like Adorno, because for me there's always also the fourth thesis on Feuerbach, which is this one you have to, that there is this split between the realm in the heaven and the realm of the earth, has to be explained out of the inner Zerrissenheit of the earthly world, and it's all about admitting the very practical character of thinking itself, and kind of and I mean, for me there would be only two. There would be kind of two explanations. One, it's kind of a polemical thing. Adorno has to oppose a certain unity of theory and practice, even if it's his very own aim. And the second one would be for me that he has no, this is a bit vulgar maybe, but that he has no concrete analysis of what precisely happened with communism in the Soviet Union, because so it's vulgar historical, but I think it's precisely there that they saw no, there can't be an immediate unity of theory and practice. They were basically saying the very same thing, and all Adorno has to say on this is, they are authoritarian, etc., which is true, but it still seems to be something which he himself can't admit as being affiliated with his very own project. So.
Would be definite Tokas next. Does this fit a little bit?
I can try.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it working or yeah? Okay. So my question is circulating around when Adorno says in Resignation, when he says that the thought somehow always survives, and that it's maybe eternal, and then I have to think of the political action as being ephemeral in the sense that it fulfills itself in the political goal that it somehow puts in front of its actions. And I was thinking I was asking myself what it says about critical theory that Adorno even answers the question of what theory has to do with political practice, or what does it say about this open wound of critical theory that he puts several pages and texts and answers just on that question, and somehow turns around points which maybe years earlier have said differently. So when we talk about critical theory as the ivory tower, as somehow related to this ivory tower theory was pointed out, I'm just asking, is it really, or isn't he just opening this tower right in the moment where he imposes himself to answering that question, because he wouldn't have to answer it, and critical theory itself gives already answers to this question. So the way his thinking is constituted already gives an answer, and him imposing himself to the act of answering does open this wound again. And I'm asking myself if this isn't itself a political action to answer that question. So this was just maybe a bit related, but not very much.
So it would be Saar Bianchi next. This is not something completely different.
Well, I've got a clarificatory question, because you brought up often the actuality of philosophy, and I was puzzled that you mentioned, or that some of us here mentioned, that there's a huge break from the early Adorno to the late Adorno. Obviously, there's a utterly different historic time. But when I read the actuality of philosophy, I thought that there are already some spurs or glimpses that shows in the direction of the later negative dialectics, when he absolutely rejects the totalizing questions and points to the gestures of problematizing. And so I thought these are hints, or not hints, but he retakes these sketches.
Just on clarification, just on that point. No, I was suggesting continuity. Yeah. And I think that there's enough continuity to suggest that this is a development, as Buckmore suggests. I think that's right, an evolution, with a more focused attention, though, on the particular character of the negative dialectic. I mean, the dialectic was present in 31, but it becomes, in a sense, the negative dialectic in 66, I think. Yeah. But that was just for clarification on that point. Maybe we should have some final thoughts, Martin. Would you like to go first? Or should I give you the last word? What would you prefer?
No, let me also just, for a quick moment, return to the Feuerbach thesis idea. And I think Schmidt-Domine is right. There is something banal in Adorno's reading that seems to also be polemically directed against other vulgar or banal readings. And it could be that this is not doing justice to anything, and of course not doing justice to Marx. But
it seems like in this point he would be just practical,
yeah,
and not theoretical.
But I like the formulation of the theory opening its own wound that you used. And there is something to this. And maybe this is also just a way of trying to rephrase our dissensus on productivity of theory. Because I would, Frau Turkas, exactly as you said, this is a theory that lays bare, lays open, that it tries to contribute to progressive emancipatory practice and cannot, or can only do so partially, because it's only theory. And tonight I was stressing the modesty, the self-reflexivity, and the fragility of that gesture. And for me, the late Adorno is, and I agree with Frieda here, differently than his former self, so skeptical, so broken, also in his historical outlook, that this is one of his last words, that critical theory is always posing the question of the connection between theory and practice, and the question of the possibility of emancipation or a different future or of even redemption, but always already saying, and we cannot provide anything substantial here. And this, of course, is one variant of the whole idea of the ban on images, the Bilderverbot, that critical theory tries to think paradise or redemption, and at the same time says we cannot. But thinking the cannot is also thinking it, but thinking it as an impossibility. And for me, these texts very much speak, in a way, in that tone, or in that tonality. And in the realm of politics, but this is something very torturous and even violent. And opening the wound, I think, is a good metaphor. It's a theory that says we try to contribute to the emancipation of the suppressed masses, but all we can offer is just another theory. But in a way, holding on to this thought that this is a wound and not just a solution or an excuse is, I think, an ethical gesture that is in itself of a certain dignity, let's say. And I would like to characterize negative dialectics also as this gesture, not just as another philosophical program, in a way responding to the failure of idealism and responding to the instrumentalization of reason in traditional or bourgeois philosophies, but also as something like a self-critical, self-reflexive stance that in a way is trying to think the wound of not being emancipation or paradise or redemption, but only aspiring to think about it. And this is something that sounds resignatory, but Adorno says, by the way, this is not resignatory, because this is thinking redemption and thinking happiness for all, but only thinking it. So all the others who try to aspire to, in a way, realize this in thinking, they are the nihilists and they are the ones having the problem. But this also makes critical theory, as I said, maybe not as doesn't make it as a sad science, as he also at one point said, but as an unstable operation, or standing somewhere where it's almost impossible to stand.
Let me just say a few words, but then give you the last.
There are no last words.
The last words. For now, at least, because I want to give you the last words for tonight, but I do want to respond to that, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that I would want to place this all back into the context of the corrective. And that's how I think I can reconcile maintain the negativity and not overcome it and not solve it or anything, but at least make sense of it. And so your emphasis today on the extreme negativity and on that dark aspect of negative dialectics, I think, is essential, and we can't, and essential and important not to abandon, in part because it is precisely the corrective within the Frankfurt School to the drift back to Kant and Hegel. Okay, in other words, it functions internally as the way to stop that dérive without going outside to the post-structuralists or others. Okay. And in that sense, it's a moment that you can't give up, because the moment you overcome it or something, or you give up on it, in some sense you are headed in a particular direction that has at the end Kant and Hegel, I think. Now, it's interesting that I find myself in that way rehabilitating Adorno, which I didn't expect. I didn't expect because to me it is there are questions of sensibility that have always, for me, posed problems, and in part this notion of the ivory tower-ness and the certain remove, and the difference, for instance, with some of the writings, say, of someone like Foucault, who always, in a way, places himself in the position of the most marginalized in society, whether it's, Herculine Babin or Pierre Rivière. And so there's a way in which that sensibility to me, particularly as a death row lawyer, is far more comfortable. And so I wasn't expecting to be placed in this way, but I do see the importance, and so now I'm going to completely rethink my relationship to these texts and to Adorno, in part because it does provide in the non-productivity, it does provide a gap stop, a way to avoid coming out of that dialectical conflict much too easily and much too quickly. It's interesting, and it's in remaining in that dialectical conflict, I think that there is the affinity to, and so we'll have to do this maybe as another next year, the affinity to Foucault's thought, to post-structuralism, to notions of aporias or aporias, right, that go on and don't end. It's interesting to see, I mean, there are some that do turn to Adorno, read Adorno in such a way as to create a revolutionary impulse. So there are these other readings. I'm thinking of this Negativity and Revolution book edited by John Holloway, Fernando Matamoros, and Sergio Tischler that I was reading, where they write, the movement of negation is a movement that detonates concepts, detonates power, detonates identity, detonates all that is familiar to us. It opens up a frightening, vertiginous, exciting world in which we are forced to question everything around us. The argument is a treading on unsafe ground, a feeling our way forward, an exploration of the world that opens up before us theoretically and practically. So there are these other readings of it that, in terms of the extreme negativity, push that extreme negativity in the direction of kind of a detonating moment. And in part, maybe that's what I was talking about when I said, if we prolong that extreme negativity too much, then maybe all there is praxis. But ultimately, I think for today at least, I will end on which I think fits perfectly actually with the negative dialectics, with this idea of wanting to hold on to the non-productivity while at the same time sensing that there is something productive in this path, productive especially today in its being a path of resistance to returns to more systematic thought that I would think are problematic. But I want you to have the last thought for us.
We have not yet even posed, you just did implicitly, the question of whether there is a form of practice or politics that would not be derived from or would follow from that kind of theory, but that would be in resonance with it. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting idea, because it would mean there would not be a relationship of subsumption between them, or of, in a way, a logical implication, but of a constellation, let's say. And I would think of forms of political life or action that would not follow from negative dialectics, but that would, in a way, take some of its features and realize it in a different realm. And there again, for me, this would be politics of disruption and of disintegration rather than of integration and synthesis. And I think in certain contexts it makes sense of stressing these forms of action. And if you would look for the kind of theory that would again, be in resonance with it, not follow from it. This would be negative dialectics. And I like the idea that critical theory defies the seduction to be more, namely to be a theory from which a practice follows. And I like the idea that there could be something like practices that correspond to it, but would not follow from it. And again, I would call them radically or extremely negative, but they would have their own productivity. But that would be a productivity of a completely different kind. So,
Good.
thank you.
All right, thank you.
So, thank you all.
Thank you all. And the only thought is we've been surrounded by these pictures of Adorno everywhere around us. So I suppose he was in the room with us this evening. Thank you so much, Martin.
Yeah, this was
And
a
thank you
pleasure.
all.
Yeah. Good night, New York.
Good night.
Falls Sie wissen wollen, was Bernard Harcourt sonst so denkt über die Gegenwart, sind Sie herzlich